Karl never stopped writing. Not letters anymore, those had served their purpose, but a memoir of sorts, documenting his journey from Wehrmacht soldier to American farmer, from believer in propaganda to witness of truth. He wrote about the power of lies and the fragility of truth, about the choices ordinary people make that enable extraordinary evil, about the possibility of redemption through honest reckoning. He never published it, wasn't sure anyone beyond his family would care, but the act of writing itself was important, a way of processing and preserving and passing on the lessons he'd learned at such terrible cost. Marguerite read his pages sometimes, offering gentle corrections or additional memories. She'd read her own sections too, describing the war from the perspective of those left behind, the terror of the bombing raids, the slow starvation, the collapse of a society built on lies. Together, they were creating a record, not for glory or absolution, but for their children and grandchildren, so future generations would understand where they'd come from and why truth mattered more than comfort. In 1950, Werner visited from Germany, having saved for years to make the journey. The two friends embraced at the train station in Omaha, and Karl was shocked by how much his friend had aged. Werner was only 38, but he looked a decade older, worn down by the hard years of rebuilding in a shattered nation. They spent a week together on the farm, talking late into the night about their experiences, their regrets, their hopes for the future. "You made the right choice," Werner told Karl one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the cornfields. "Germany needs people like us to rebuild, yes, but your children, they have a chance here. Hilda and I, we do what we can. But Sophie will grow up in the shadow of what we did. She'll carry that shame her whole life. Your children, they have the chance to build something new, something clean." Karl shook his head. "There's nothing clean about running away, Werner. We carry the shame here too. The difference is just that here, they also have opportunity. But the burden, the knowledge of what our nation did, that travels across oceans. That stays in the blood." They talked about the letters, about how they'd spread through Hamburg and beyond, about the small role they'd played in helping people question the propaganda. Werner told him that after the war, when the full extent of the atrocities became undeniable, those letters had taken on new meaning. They'd been proof that some Germans had questioned, had seen through the lies even if they hadn't acted decisively enough to stop them. It wasn't much, wasn't nearly enough, but it was something. "Do you regret it?" Werner asked. "Writing those letters? Telling the truth about America? Some people back home still call you a traitor, you know. They say you betrayed Germany to curry favor with your captors." Karl considered the question seriously. "I regret that I didn't question earlier, didn't resist when resistance might have mattered. But the letters? No. The truth needed to be told, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it made me look disloyal. Loyalty to a regime built on lies isn't a virtue, Werner. It's a sin of omission. A failure of moral courage. I wish I'd had the courage earlier to speak truth to power. Writing those letters from safety was the least I could do." The 1950s brought prosperity to the Campbell farm and to America generally. The economy boomed, technology advanced, and the Neumanns found themselves part of an expanding middle class that would have been unimaginable in post-war Germany. They bought a car, took vacations, sent their children to college. The material comfort was welcome, but Karl never forgot the contrast with what he'd left behind. Never let himself become complacent in abundance while knowing others still struggled. He sent money back to Germany whenever he could spare it, helping Werner's family and others rebuild. He sponsored other German immigrants, helping them navigate the system he'd learned, offering the same kind of support the Campbells had given him. It became a kind of mission, this paying forward of the grace he'd received, this tangible way of atoning for the past while building toward a better future. Greta married a local boy, David Richardson, whose father had fought in Europe and harbored some prejudice against Germans. But David himself judged Greta for who she was, and their marriage became another small bridge across the chasm of war. When they had children, Karl's grandchildren, he looked at them and saw the future, these kids who were both German and American, who carried history but were defined by it. who had the chance to be simply human in a way his generation had failed to achieve. Hans took over more of the farm work as Karl aged, showing the same dedication and skill his father had developed. He married later to a German-American woman named Clara, whose parents had immigrated before the war. And together they expanded the farm's operations, buying adjacent land, modernizing equipment, building on the foundation Joseph and Karl had established. The Campbell farm became the Karl Neumann farm, a partnership that spanned cultures and generations, built on trust earned through years of shared labor. Joseph Campbell passed away in 1962, at 83, surrounded by family both biological and adopted. Karl spoke at the funeral, his English now fluent after 16 years in America, and told the gathered crowd about a man who had chosen to see humanity in his enemy, who had offered not just employment, but genuine friendship, who had taught by example that grace was stronger than hate. Martha lived another decade, and Karl and Marguerite cared for her as she aged, a role reversal that felt right, a way of honoring the woman who had welcomed them with such openness. The Vietnam War brought new complexity to Karl's understanding of America. He watched young men being sent to fight in a distant conflict, saw the protests and the divisions, and recognized echoes of the propaganda and unquestioning obedience that had led Germany to ruin. He spoke out at community meetings, carefully and respectfully, sharing his experience of being a soldier who'd believed what he was told only to discover it was all lies. Some dismissed him as a former enemy with no right to criticize America, but others, especially younger people facing the draft, listened with desperate attention. "Question everything," Karl told a group of college students who visited the farm for a school project on immigration in 1968. "Question your government, question the media, question even your own certainty. I failed to do this, and I served evil as a result. I thought I was a patriot, thought I was serving my country, but I was actually enabling atrocities because I didn't ask the hard questions. Don't make my mistake. Patriotism without discernment is dangerous. Love your country enough to demand it be worthy of that love." Quote, Greta became a teacher, dedicating herself to education as a way of preventing the kind of ignorance and manipulation that had enabled the Third Reich. She taught history with unflinching honesty, making sure her students understood not just what happened, but how it happened, the incremental steps by which ordinary people were led to accept the unacceptable. She used her father's story, his letters, his journey from believer to witness, as a case study in the power of propaganda and the importance of critical thinking. Hans, working the land, found his own way to honor the lessons of the past. He farmed sustainably, treating the soil with respect, building for future generations, rather than exploiting for immediate gain. He hired workers fairly, treating them with the dignity he'd learned from Joseph Campbell and his father. He created a small scholarship fund for children of immigrants, especially those from former enemy nations, helping them access education and opportunity the way his family had been helped. Marguerite, in her later years, finally wrote down her own memories of the war years in Hamburg. Her account was raw and painful, describing the terror of the bombing raids, the anguish of not knowing if Karl was alive, the desperate measures required to keep the children fed. But she also wrote about the letters, how they'd arrived like messages from another world, how they'd been passed from hand to hand, copied and recopied until the words were nearly illegible, shared in whispers in bomb shelters, ruined apartments. Karl's letters told us that somewhere, life was still normal, she wrote. That somewhere, people still sat down to meals and worried about harvests, and showed kindness to strangers. In our darkest moments, when Hamburg was burning and we huddled in cellars waiting for death, those letters reminded us that the world was larger than our nightmare. They gave us something to survive for, a future we could barely imagine but desperately needed to believe in. My husband thought he was just writing home to his family, but his words became a light in the darkness for so many. The original letters, carefully preserved, became family treasures. Karl's grandchildren would read them, marveling at the elegant cursive, the careful descriptions, the evidence of their grandfather's journey from soldier to witness. Teachers asked to use them in classes. Historians wanted to study them as primary sources. But Karl kept them mostly private, sharing only occasionally when he felt it served a larger purpose. They weren't artifacts to be displayed, but living documents, reminders of responsibilities still owed. In 1975, Karl and Marguerite made their first trip back to Germany since they'd left nearly 30 years earlier. Werner had passed away 2 years before, and they'd come for a memorial, but also to see how the nation had changed, to confront what they'd left behind. Hamburg was rebuilt now, modern and prosperous, barely recognizable from the rubble they'd fled. The apartment building on Rothenbaum 2C had been demolished and replaced with new construction. The physical evidence of the war was mostly gone, smoothed over by time and development. But the memory remained, in monuments and museums, in the older people's eyes, in the careful way people spoke about the past. Karl visited the sites of former concentration camps, now memorials, and stood in the spaces where horror had unfolded while he served and survived and did nothing to stop it. The guilt was as fresh as ever, undiminished by decades, and he wept openly in those places, Marguerite's hand in his, both of them finally confronting in full measure what their nation had done. They also visited with Hilda, Werner's widow, and Sophie, now a grown woman with children of her own. Sophie worked as a social worker, dedicating her life to helping refugees and displaced persons, carrying forward her father's commitment to witness and assistance. She showed them Werner's copies of Karl's letters, now yellowed and fragile, preserved in a box with other family documents. "Papa said these letters saved his sanity," Sophie told them. When everything seemed hopeless, when the work of rebuilding seemed too enormous, he would read these and remember that redemption was possible, that people could change, that grace existed in the world. Back in Nebraska, Karl intensified his writing, feeling the urgency of age. He was 72 now, Marguerite 70, and the years remaining were uncertain. He wanted to finish his memoir, to complete the record, to ensure the lessons weren't lost. He wrote about the danger of propaganda, about how ordinary people could be led to accept extraordinary evil through gradual normalization. He wrote about the importance of bearing witness, of speaking uncomfortable truths even at personal cost. He wrote about grace and redemption, about the possibility of building bridges even across chasms of history and hatred. Young people still came to interview him, students working on papers, journalists writing retrospectives on the war, researchers studying prisoner of war experiences. He welcomed them all, answering questions with patient honesty, never hiding his shame, but also never wallowing in it. He tried to help them understand that evil wasn't only committed by monsters, but by ordinary people who failed to question, who chose comfort over conscience, who told themselves that one person couldn't make a Reich difference. "I was that ordinary person," he would tell them. "I wasn't a Nazi ideologue, wasn't particularly political, just wanted to serve my country and support my family. But my ordinariness, my willingness to not ask hard questions, my acceptance of what I was told, that made me complicit in evil. And when I finally saw the truth, when I was far from home in a Nebraska prison camp, I had a choice. I could reject what I was seeing, because it contradicted everything I'd been taught. Or I could accept the uncomfortable reality and bear witness to it. Those letters home were my choice to witness, inadequate as it was." Karl Neumann passed away in 1983 at the age of 80, with Marguerite holding his hand and his children and grandchildren surrounding his bed. His last words were in German, spoken to Marguerite. "We made it, my love. We survived and we witnessed and we built something good. That's enough. That has to be enough." His funeral was attended by hundreds, not just family but farm workers and neighbors, former students of Greta's, people from the church. Even some who'd initially opposed having Germans in their community, but had been won over by decades of honest, decent living. The pastor read from Karl's memoir, the sections about grace and redemption, about the power of choosing truth over comfort, about the responsibility each person carries to question and to witness and to build bridges rather than walls. Marguerite lived another 12 years, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1995 at 87. Before she passed, she ensured that Karl's complete writings, along with the original letters and her own memoir, were donated to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, a permanent record of one family's journey through darkness toward light. The museum created an exhibit featuring the letters titled "Truth Across Enemy Lines," and thousands of visitors read Karl's careful descriptions of American abundance and humanity, his gradual awakening to the lies he'd been told, his choice to witness honestly despite the personal cost. The Campbell Neumann farm continues to this day, worked by Hans's children and grandchildren, a testament to the partnership between a Nebraska farmer who chose grace over hatred and a German prisoner who chose truth over comfort. On the wall of the main farmhouse hangs a framed letter, the first one Karl wrote home from Camp Atlanta, his words still visible after all these decades. "The stories we heard about America," it reads, "they were not entirely accurate. Those simple words, carefully chosen to pass the censor while still conveying truth, had traveled across an ocean, then copied and shared and whispered about in the darkness of a collapsing regime. They'd given hope to people who desperately needed it, proof that somewhere beyond the propaganda and the lies, reality still existed. They'd been one small light against an ocean of darkness, inadequate and late and born of circumstances beyond Karl's control, but real nonetheless. The lesson remained, carved into the lives Karl and Marguerite built, passed down through generations of children who carried both German and American blood, who understood that truth required courage and witness required sacrifice and redemption, required honest reckoning with the past. The letters had been Karl's witness, imperfect but sincere, and they endured as evidence that even in the darkest times, even from the most unlikely places, truth could find a way to speak, and grace could build bridges across the widest chasms of hatred and war. German POWs were shocked when allowed to write letters home and tell the truth about America. Sergeant Karl Neumann stared at the blank paper in his trembling hands, unable to believe what the American guard had just told him. "Write home. Tell your family you're alive." He'd been prepared for interrogation, for punishment, for silence, but not this. Not permission to reach across an ocean of war and touch the lives he thought he'd lost forever. What he didn't know was that the words he was about to write would shatter everything the Nazi propaganda machine had told him about America, and that his letters would become dangerous whispers of truth in a Reich built on lies. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The North African sun had been merciless on that November day in 1942 when Karl's world turned upside down. The Battle of El Alamein had transformed the desert into a graveyard of twisted metal and broken dreams, and Karl found himself among the thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers, stumbling into Allied captivity with dust-caked uniforms and hollow eyes. He remembered the propaganda films he'd watched in Berlin, the ones showing barbaric Americans torturing prisoners, denying them food and water, treating them worse than animals. As British soldiers herded them into trucks, Karl braced himself for the brutality he'd been promised would come, but the expected beatings never materialized. Instead, there was water, warm bread, and medical attention for the wounded. Karl touched the bandage on his shoulder, where a British medic had cleaned and dressed his shrapnel wound, the same shoulder that enemy fire had torn into just hours before. He caught the eye of his friend Werner Hoffmann, a corporal from Munich, who looked equally confused by this treatment. They'd served together since Poland, shared rations and foxholes, and now shared this bewildering experience of humane captivity. The journey from North Africa to England took 3 weeks aboard a converted cargo ship, and from there, another 2 weeks across the Atlantic to America. Karl spent those weeks in the ship's hold with hundreds of other prisoners, listening to the older soldiers spin theories about what awaited them. Some insisted the Americans were simply fattening them up before the real torture began. Others whispered that everything they'd been told about the enemy was a lie. Karl didn't know what to believe anymore, but he watched carefully, noting every small kindness, every piece of bread that wasn't moldy, every guard who didn't raise a hand in anger. When the Statue of Liberty appeared on the horizon in December of 1942, Karl pressed his face against the porthole, straining to see this symbol he'd been taught represented a decadent, failing democracy. The statue looked larger than he'd imagined, more solid, standing proud in the winter. Sunlight. Around him, other prisoners crowded to glimpse their first sight of America, and the hold filled with murmurs of surprise and speculation. This wasn't supposed to be how it looked. Where was the poverty? Where were the signs of a nation on its knees? The train ride from New York to Nebraska took 3 days, and Karl couldn't stop staring out the windows. The American countryside rolled past in an endless display of farms and small towns. And what struck him most was the abundance. Tractors sat in fields like patient metal beasts. Barns stood sturdy and well-maintained. And in the towns they passed through, he glimpsed shops with windows full of goods. Children waved at the train, not with fear or hatred, but with simple curiosity. Karl thought of his own children back in Hamburg, 7-year-old Greta and 5-year-old Hans, and wondered what they were eating tonight, if the rations were enough. If the bombs had come close to their apartment. Camp Atlanta in central Nebraska appeared on a frozen January morning, a collection of barracks surrounded by wire fencing and guard towers. Set against a landscape so flat and white that it seemed to stretch into infinity. As the prisoners filed off the trucks, Karl expected the harsh commands and rifle butts he'd been trained to anticipate, but instead, an American officer with a clipboard simply directed them toward processing with a tired efficiency that suggested this was just another day's work. The officer spoke German, haltingly but clearly, and explained the camp rules in a tone that reminded Karl more of a school administrator than a prison warden. The barracks were heated. This simple fact struck Karl with the force of revelation as he stepped inside and felt warm air wash over his frozen face. Bunk beds lined the walls, each with a mattress, 2 blankets, and a pillow. Werner collapsed onto a bottom bunk and let out a long breath. "This can't be real," he muttered, running his hand over the wool blanket. "It's some kind of trick." But as days turned into weeks, the trick never revealed itself. Instead, there were routines. Breakfast arrived at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6, and the food, while not lavish, was more than adequate. Real coffee, not the bitter ersatz brew they'd choked down in the Wehrmacht. Bread that was soft and white, not the dense black loaves mixed with sawdust to stretch the flour. Meat several times a week. Karl found himself eating better than he had in the final months before his capture. Better perhaps than his family was eating right now in rationed Hamburg. The day the camp commander, Colonel Harrison Fletcher, announced that prisoners could write letters home, Karl thought he'd misheard. He was sitting in the mess hall when the colonel, a tall man with gray temples and a weathered face that suggested he'd seen action in the Great War, made the announcement through a translator. Letters would be censored, of course, to prevent any military intelligence from reaching the Reich, but personal news, assurances of health and survival, these could be sent. The room erupted in disbelief, and then desperate joy. Karl received his paper and envelope that evening, along with a stubby pencil that had been sharpened so many times it was barely 3 inches long. He sat at the table in the barracks, surrounded by other men hunched over their own letters, and stared at the blank page for almost an hour. Where did he even begin? How could he compress months of war, capture, and this strange, comfortable imprisonment into words that would pass the censor and still convey truth? Finally, his pencil began to move. "My dearest Marguerite," he wrote, forming each letter carefully in case this was the only chance he'd get. "I am alive and well in a place called Nebraska in America. I know you must have feared the worst after so many months of silence. I feared it myself. Feared I would never see your face again, or hear Greta's laugh, or feel Hans's small hand in mine. But I am here, and I am safe, and I am treated fairly." He paused, considering his next words carefully. The censor would read this, but more importantly, Marguerite would read it, and she would know his heart and his mind well enough to understand what he couldn't say directly. "The stories we heard about America," he continued, "they were not entirely accurate. The people here are not monsters. The guards are firm but not cruel. We have food, shelter, and warmth. In some ways, I am more comfortable here than I was in our final months of service. Karl wrote about the landscape, describing the endless flatness of Nebraska, the way snow piled in drifts against the barracks, the brilliant stars visible on clear nights without the interference of city lights. He wrote about Werner, whom Marguerite had met once before the war at a regimental gathering, and how they looked out for each other. He asked about the children, about her parents, about their neighbors the Goldsteins if they were still there, though he suspected he knew the answer to that question, and the knowledge sat like a stone in his chest. "Tell Greta that her papa thinks of her every night," he wrote, tears now blurring his vision. "Tell Hans that I will bring him a story about cowboys and wide-open spaces when I come home. Tell them both that I love them more than all the stars I can see from this strange land. Tell them I am learning things here that I wish I had known before. Kiss them for me. Marguerite. Kiss them, and hold them, and keep them safe, until I can return to do it myself." He signed the letter with a shaking hand, and sealed it in the envelope, addressing it to their apartment on Rothenbaum-Kusse in Hamburg. Would it reach her? Would the bombs have destroyed their building? Would the Nazi censors who surely read all incoming mail from America allow it through? He handed the letter to Sergeant Willis, the American guard who collected them, and tried not to hope too hard. The work assignments began in February. The Geneva Convention stipulated that prisoners of war could be put to work, provided the labor was not directly related to military operations, and Nebraska's farms desperately needed hands after Sobia. Many young American men had shipped overseas. Karl found himself assigned to a work detail at a farm owned by a man named Joseph Campbell, 15 miles from the camp. Every morning, a truck would carry Karl and 20 other prisoners to various farms in the area, guarded by a single soldier who seemed more interested in his sandwich than in watching for escape attempts. Joseph Campbell was a weathered man in his 60s, with hands like leather and a face deeply lined by sun and wind. He spoke no German, and Karl's English consisted of maybe 50 words, learned from guards and fellow prisoners who'd picked up more, but somehow they communicated. Joseph showed them the machinery, the enormous tractors that could plow in a day what would have taken a team of horses a week. He demonstrated the corn planters, the irrigation systems, the grain silos that stood like monuments to agricultural abundance. What struck Karl most was the casual efficiency of it all. One man with a tractor could work hundreds of acres. The machinery was well maintained, fuel was available, replacement parts could be ordered from manufacturers who were apparently still producing civilian goods even in wartime. Karl thought of the German farms he'd seen, where horses were being starved because feed was requisitioned for the military, where equipment broke down and couldn't be fixed because every piece of metal was being melted beak for weapons. During the lunch break, Joseph's wife Martha brought food to the fields. Thick sandwiches with real ham, apples that were crisp and fresh, cookies that tasted of butter and sugar. She smiled at the prisoners and spoke to them in slow, simple English, asking if they had enough, if they needed more. Karl noticed she wore a gold star pin on her coat, the kind that meant she had a son in military service. Her son was probably fighting against Germany at this very moment. Yet here she was, feeding German prisoners with genuine kindness in her eyes. Werner noticed it too. That evening, back in the barracks, he sat on his bunk, staring at nothing. "Her son might have killed our friends," he said quietly. "We might have killed her son. Yet she gave us cookies. She smiled at us. How do we understand this?" Karl had no answer. He was writing another letter to Marguerite, trying to describe the tractors, the vast fields, the curious hospitality of people who should have been their bitterest enemies. "I am working on a farm now," he wrote. "The machines here are like nothing we have at home. One tractor does the work of 20 men and 20 horses. The farmer's wife brings us lunch and treats us like human beings. Even though her son fights on the other side of this war, I do not understand this country, Marguerite. Nothing is as we were told it would be." End quote. Months passed, and the letters continued. Not every prisoner wrote home, some out of pride, some because they had no one left to write to. But Karl wrote weekly when paper was available, and slowly, incredibly, letters began to arrive in return. Marguerite's first response reached him in April, having taken nearly 3 months to make the journey. Her handwriting was the same graceful script he remembered, though the paper was thin and cheap, likely the best she could obtain. She wrote carefully, knowing Nazi censors would read every word, but Karl could read between the lines. The children were well, though Greta was having nightmares about the sirens. Food was tight, but they were managing. His parents had been moved to a smaller apartment after theirs was damaged in a raid. The Goldsteins were gone, she didn't say where, and Karl felt his chest tighten because he knew. His suspicions about what was happening to the Jews had grown during his service, whispers shared among soldiers, things seen and not spoken of, and now confirmation settled over him like a shroud. But Marguerite also wrote something that made his heart race. "Your letters are being shared," she wrote cryptically. "Your Uncle Friedrich found them very interesting. He has shown them to friends who also have family far away. They are grateful for news of different places." Karl understood immediately. The letters were being passed around, read quietly among people who were hungry for any information that contradicted the official narrative. His words about America, about abundance and humanity, and tractors and kindness, were spreading like seeds in hungry soil. The responsibility of this knowledge weighed on him. He became even more careful in his letters, more precise in his descriptions, trying to paint an accurate picture without making claims that could be dismissed as propaganda. He described the camp library, where books were available in German and English. He wrote about the medical care when Werner caught influenza and was treated by an American doctor with real medicine, not the ersatz remedies they'd grown accustomed to. He mentioned the baseball games the Americans organized between prisoner teams, the small wages they could earn from farm work to buy personal items from the camp canteen. One day in June, Joseph Campbell approached Karl in the field and, through a combination of gestures and simple words, invited him to dinner at the farmhouse. Karl was stunned. Fraternization between prisoners and civilians was technically forbidden, but the rules in rural Nebraska seemed to be interpreted loosely. The guard, a young private named Danny who was from a farm himself, simply shrugged and said he'd wait in the truck. Martha Campbell set a table that made Karl want to weep. Roasted chicken, potatoes with butter, fresh vegetables from the garden, bread that was still warm from the oven, and apple pie for dessert. The Campbells had 2 daughters, both married to servicemen overseas, whose photographs sat on the mantel. Joseph said a brief grace, thanking God for the food and asking for the safe return of all sons. And Karl understood enough to know that prayer included German sons too. They ate mostly in silence, the language barrier too significant for much conversation. But Martha kept filling Karl's plate, and Joseph nodded approvingly when Karl complimented the food in his broken English. After dinner, Joseph brought out a photo album and showed Karl pictures of the farm through the years, the family growing, the land being worked, the harvest celebrated. It was a life Karl recognized, a life built on work and family, and the slow accumulation of small prosperities, not so different from what he'd hoped to build in Hamburg before the war consumed everything. When the evening ended and Karl climbed back into the truck, he carried with him a paper bag Martha had pressed into his hands. Inside were 2 pieces of pie, wrapped in waxed paper, cookies, and a bar of real chocolate. "For your friend," she'd said in careful German, and Karl realized she'd learned the words just to say this to him. He shared the bounty with Werner that night, and they ate in wondering silence. 2 soldiers from a regime that had promised them the world while giving them ashes, now receiving kindness from people they'd been taught to despise. Karl's next letter tried to capture the experience. "I had dinner with the farmer and his wife tonight," he wrote to Marguerite. "They have daughters whose husbands fight against our homeland, yet they welcomed me to their table as a guest. The food was more than I've seen in years. Marguerite. Real butter. Fresh vegetables. Meat that wasn't stretched with filler or saved from spoilage. And they shared it freely with someone who, by all rights, they should consider their enemy. I am beginning to understand that everything we were told about this place was a lie. Not a small lie or an exaggeration, but a fundamental untruth about the nature of this country and its country, people." He knew the censor would read these words, might even strike them out, but he had to write them. The truth was too large to keep silent. I think about the newsreels we watched, he continued. The ones showing breadlines in America, showing a nation on the verge of collapse. Either those images were from another time, or they were fabricated entirely. What I see here is abundance, not just for the wealthy, but for ordinary farmers, tractors and trucks and machinery that works, food that is plentiful, people who are free to speak their minds, at least from what I can observe. I do not say this to be disloyal to our Sela. Homeland. Marguerite. I say it because the truth matters, and because I believe you deserve to know what I have learned. Summer brought longer work days and deeper insights into American agricultural life. Karl learned to operate the tractors, massive machines that thrummed with power and possibility. Joseph taught him patiently, showing him the controls, the timing, the rhythm of the work. There was pride in Joseph's instruction, pride in his land and his equipment and his expertise, and Karl found himself responding to it, wanting to do the work well, to prove himself capable. Other prisoners were assigned to different farms, and in the evenings, they would share their experiences. Heinrich Volker worked for a family with 4 sons in the service, and the father had shown Heinrich photographs of his boys in uniform with something like defiance, as if daring Heinrich to see them as anything but human prey. Otto Kraus helped repair a barn, and was paid not just in the scrip the camp issued, but with a real silver dollar. The farmer pressed into his hand, saying through a translator that good work deserved good pay. The stories accumulated, and they all pointed to the same impossible truth, that the reality of America bore no resemblance to the propaganda they'd absorbed. This wasn't a nation of mongrel races destroying themselves through race mixing, as they'd been taught. This wasn't a country on the brink of starvation and chaos. This was a functioning society with rules and order, and a prosperity that seemed to extend even to its rural corners, even in wartime, even when feeding and arming half the world. Karl wrote all of it down, letter after letter, and Marguerite's responses told him the letters were still being shared, still being whispered about among people who were beginning to question what they'd been told. Uncle Friedrich says more friends want to read your letters, she wrote. They are hungry for your descriptions. Some refuse to believe them. They say you must be writing under duress, that the Americans are forcing you to speak well of them. But others, Karl, others are starting to wonder. If you are lying, you are a very good liar. But I know you, my love. I know your heart and your words. And I believe you are telling the truth, you see. The weight of being believed, of being a source of dangerous truth, settled more heavily on Karl's shoulders. He thought carefully about each letter now, aware that his words might influence how people back home thought about the war, about their leaders, about the future. He wasn't a political man, had never been particularly interested in ideology, but he was becoming a witness, and that carried its own responsibilities. In August of 1943, a Red Cross inspector visited the camp. This was routine under the Geneva Convention, but Karl and the other prisoners prepared carefully, unsure what to expect. The inspector was a Swiss man named Andreas Müller, precise and thorough, who interviewed prisoners privately and inspected every aspect of the camp. Karl answered his questions honestly when his turn came, describing the food, the work conditions, the treatment by guards, the letters home. Andreas listened carefully and took notes, his face neutral. At the end of the interview, he looked at Karl directly and said in German, "What you describe is consistent with what we've found at other camps in America. The conditions meet or exceed the requirements of the convention, but I sense there is something more you want to say." Karl hesitated, then spoke carefully. "I want to say that everything we were told about this country was a lie. I want to say that the contrast between what I see here and what we were promised about our enemies is so vast that it calls into question everything else we were told. But mostly, I want to ask what is happening to our families while we sit here in comfort. My wife writes in careful words because she knows the censors read her letters. But I can feel her fear. I can read the hunger between her lines. We are fed and warm while they starve and freeze. How is that justice?" Andreas's expression softened slightly. "That is a question above my authority to answer," he said quietly. I can only document what I see and report to both sides that the conventions are being followed. But I will tell you this. Off the record, you are right to question what you were told. The truth is important, and if you have the opportunity to share it, you should. Not as propaganda, but as witness. The world will need witnesses when this is over. Karl carried those words with him as autumn arrived, and the harvests began. He worked alongside Joseph and a handful of hired hands from town, bringing in corn and wheat, filling the silos until they practically burst. The abundance was staggering. Joseph mentioned casually through a translator that this year's harvest was good but not exceptional, maybe 80% of the 1941 yield. Karl did the mental arithmetic and realized that even at 80%, this single farm produced more grain than some entire villages he'd seen in occupied Poland. The machinery made the difference. The tractors that never seemed to break down, the combines that could harvest acres in hours, the trucks that transported grain to markets that apparently had buyers ready to pay fair prices. The entire system worked with a mechanical efficiency that Karl had been taught was impossible in a democratic, capitalist society. He'd been told such societies were chaotic, inefficient, doomed to collapse under their own contradictions. Yet here was the evidence against those claims, as tangible as the grain pouring into silos. He wrote to Marguerite about the harvest, describing the golden wheat fields, the satisfaction of work well done, the farmer's pleasure in a successful season. Joseph told me today that much of this grain will go to feed soldiers, Karl wrote. American soldiers, British soldiers, perhaps even Russian soldiers, the enemy of my enemy, being fed from these Nebraska fields, but he said it with neither pride nor shame, just as a fact. This is what his country asks of him, and he does it. There is a simplicity to it that I find both strange and admirable. He doesn't seem to hate us, Marguerite. He doesn't seem to hate anyone. He simply does his work and trusts that it serves some larger goal. Purpose. Werner received a letter in October that changed something in him. His wife Hilda wrote that their apartment in Munich had been destroyed in a bombing raid. She and their daughter Sophie had survived by sheltering in the cellar, but they'd lost everything. They were now living with Hilda's sister in a single room, sharing rations meant for one family between two. The letter was matter-of-fact. Hilda was a practical woman, but the desperation bled through the careful words. Werner sat on his bunk holding the letter, and Karl watched his friend's face cycle through emotions, grief and rage and helplessness. Finally, Werner looked up at Karl with hollow eyes. "We're here eating 3 meals a day while they starve in ruins," he said. "How did this happen? How did we end up on the wrong side of everything?" Karl had no answer that would comfort, but he sat beside his friend and let Werner talk through the night. They spoke of their families, their hopes before the war, the moment each of them realized that something was deeply wrong with the regime they served. For Werner, it had been in France, watching SS units round up Jews while regular Wehrmacht soldiers were ordered to look away. For Karl, it had been earlier, on Kristallnacht in Hamburg, when he'd heard the breaking glass and seen the synagogues burning, and felt a shame so deep he couldn't speak of it. "We were cowards," Werner said finally. "We saw and we did nothing. We questioned nothing. We believed what was convenient to believe and ignored what was inconvenient. And now our families pay the price while we sit in this comfortable prison, fed by the people we tried to destroy." The words hung in the air, too true to deny. Karl thought about writing them to Marguerite, but knew he couldn't, not directly. The censors would never allow such sedition through. But perhaps there were other ways to convey the truth. More subtle ways. "I have been thinking much lately about choices," he wrote in his next letter. "About the things we choose to see and the things we choose to ignore. About the comfort of believing what we are told rather than questioning what doesn't feel right in our hearts. About the responsibility we each carry for the world we help create through our action or inaction. These thoughts are heavy, Marguerite, but I believe they are important. I believe we must carry them if we are to be better when this is over." Christmas of 1943 arrived with snow and a strange melancholy that settled over the camp. The Americans made efforts to mark the holiday, allowing prisoners to hold a church service, providing extra rations, even permitting some decoration of the barracks. Joseph Campbell sent a truck loaded with donated items from the local community. Warm clothes, books, small gifts, things that weren't strictly necessary but showed that somewhere, people cared. Karl attended the Christmas Eve service in the camp chapel, a simple building that served all faiths. The chaplain, an American captain named Robert Walsh, gave a sermon about peace and the brotherhood of man, and Karl found himself weeping quietly. He thought of Greta and Hans, wondered what kind of Christmas they were having in bombed Hamburg, if there were any gifts, any treats, any moment of joy in the darkness. He thought of all the Christmases to come. How many more before this war ended, before he could hold his children again? He wrote a special letter that night, pouring his heart onto the page. My dearest Marguerite, on this holy night, I think of you and the children and pray that you are safe and together. I imagine Greta is trying to stay awake to glimpse St. Nicholas, and Hans is excited beyond sleep. I hope you have found a way to make some small celebration, some light in the darkness. Here, the Americans have been kind. They allowed us to sing carols and share in a special meal. They do not hate us. Marguerite, I know I've written this before, but on this night of all nights, it seems important to say again. They do not hate us. They fight against what we represented, against the ideology that sent us to war. But they do not hate us as men. There is a lesson in that, a profound one. I pray I am worthy of learning it. The new year brought changes. More prisoners arrived from the European theater as Allied successes mounted, and they brought news from home that grew increasingly grim. The bombing campaigns were intensifying. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Resources were being diverted to desperate last stands. The new prisoners also brought fresh perspectives on America, their own shock at the conditions, the food, the treatment, the disconnect between propaganda and reality. One new arrival, a lieutenant named Jürgen Schmidt, who'd been captured in Italy, sat at Karl's table during dinner and looked around in disbelief. "This is a prison camp?" he asked. "This is how the decadent Americans treat their prisoners? With hot food and warm beds and medical care? I was told we'd be worked to death in mines, starved and beaten. I was told American soldiers collected German ears as trophies." Karl watched the lieutenant process his confusion, remembered his own journey from skepticism to acceptance. "Everything we were told was a lie," Karl said simply. "Not exaggeration, not distortion, an outright lie. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you can start to see clearly." Jürgen's arrival reminded Karl of his responsibility as a witness. He'd become comfortable in his routine, the farm work, the letters home, the slow passage of seasons in captivity. But each new prisoner was a reminder that there were men still fighting for a regime built on falsehoods, still believing the propaganda, still convinced they fought for something righteous. His letters to Marguerite, being shared among the Hamburg underground of doubters and questioners, might be a tiny light against that darkness, but it was the light he could offer. Spring of 1944 brought news that made Karl's heart race with hope and fear. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The Reich was being squeezed from all sides now. The end was becoming imaginable, if not yet inevitable. But what would that end look like? What would be left of Germany? Of Hamburg? Of the apartment on Rothenbaum Chaussee, where Marguerite and the children waited? Marguerite's letters grew more cryptic as 1944 progressed. She wrote of Uncle Friedrich's reading group growing larger, meeting more frequently. She mentioned that Karl's letters were now being copied by hand and distributed, his words about American tractors and abundance and human decency passing from person to person like contraband truth. "You are giving people hope," she wrote. "Hope that the world is not as dark as we have been told, that there might be something worth surviving for beyond this nightmare." The responsibility terrified him. He was just a sergeant, a farmer's son from Hamburg who'd been conscripted into a war he never wanted. Now his words were circulating in a police state, potentially putting Marguerite and others in danger. He wrote back begging her to be careful, to protect herself and the children above all else. But even as he wrote those words, he knew she wouldn't stop. Truth, once discovered, demanded to be shared, regardless of the risk. The work at the Campbell farm continued through the seasons. Karl had become proficient with the machinery now, could operate the tractors with confidence, understood the rhythms of planting and harvesting. Joseph trusted him with increasingly complex tasks, and Karl took pride in that trust, in the validation of his competence from a man he'd come to respect. They developed a working relationship that transcended language, communication through gestures and simple words, and a shared understanding of the land and its demands. One evening in July, as they were finishing the day's work, Joseph pulled Karl aside and spoke slowly in his limited German, words he'd clearly practiced. "You good man," Joseph said, gripping Karl's shoulder. "War make enemies, but men, just men. You understand?" Karl nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Joseph continued. "War ends someday. You go home. You tell people, Americans not devils, just farmers, just fathers, same as you. You tell." "Yes," Karl managed. "I tell. I promise." That night, Karl wrote one of his most carefully composed letters. "I made a promise today to a man who has become more than just my employer. I promised to tell the truth about what I have seen and learned here. So let me say this clearly, for you and for everyone who reads these words. The Americans are not the monsters we were told they were. They are farmers and fathers, shopkeepers and teachers, people who work hard and love their families and believe in something beyond themselves. Their system is not perfect. I have seen poverty here too, have heard stories of injustice and inequality, but the fundamental propaganda we were fed, that America is a weak and decadent nation on the verge of collapse, that its people are subhuman and corrupt, that is absolutely and completely false." He paused, knowing the censor would likely strike through much of this, but he continued anyway. "I fear what I will find when I return home. I fear the destruction, the loss, the reckoning that must come. But I also hope, because I have seen that people can be better than their governments, that kindness can exist between enemies, that truth can survive beneath layers of lies. These things I have learned in Nebraska, in a prison camp that is more humane than the free society I left behind. These things I offer as small lights against the darkness." As 1944 turned to 1945, the news from Europe became both more hopeful and more horrific. The Allies advanced on all fronts. Liberation seemed inevitable. But the stories emerging from the concentration camps, the full scale of the separate atrocities, shook Karl to his core. He'd suspected, had heard whispers, but the reality exceeded his worst fears. The systematic murder of millions, the industrialization of genocide, the depths of evil that had been perpetrated in Germany's name. Werner came to him one night, shaking, having heard from another prisoner about Dachau's liberation. "We knew," Werner said, his voice hollow. "We told ourselves we didn't, but we knew. The trains, the camps, the disappearances. We knew, and we did nothing. We were good Germans, following orders, believing it wasn't our business. And now this. How do we live with this? How do we go home, carrying this knowledge?" Karl had no answer. The guilt was crushing, the weight of complicity even in ignorance. He thought of the Goldsteins, their neighbors who'd disappeared, and the casual way everyone had accepted their absence. He thought of all the small moments of cowardice, all the times he'd looked away, told himself it wasn't his concern, that he was just a soldier following orders. The comfort he'd found in this American prison felt obscene now, a luxury he didn't deserve while millions had suffered and died. He tried to write to Marguerite about it, but couldn't find the words. How did you confess collective guilt in a letter that censors would read? How did you speak of shame so profound it had no bottom? Finally, he wrote simply, "The reports from home, the discoveries being made as the Reich falls, they confirm our worst fears. We will carry this burden for the rest of our lives. All of us who wore the uniform, who served even passively, there is no absolution for this. There is only the responsibility to remember, to witness, to ensure it can never happen again. This I vow to you, to our children, to the memory of all who suffered. This I vow." The war in Europe ended in May of 1945, and the camp erupted in complicated emotions. Relief that the killing had stopped, fear about what came next, uncertainty about the future. The guards seemed almost as confused as the prisoners about what this meant. Would they be sent home immediately, kept indefinitely, tried for war crimes? The Geneva Convention provided guidelines, but the scale of this war, the nature of Germany's crimes, made everything uncertain. Karl's letters to Marguerite went unanswered for months. The postal system had collapsed, and he didn't know if she was alive, if the children had survived, if Hamburg still stood. He wrote anyway. Letter after letter, stacking up in the camp mailroom, waiting for a system that might never function again. In the absence of her replies, he wrote to the ghost of their life together, describing his days, his thoughts, his hopes and fears for when they might be reunited. Joseph Campbell came to visit him at the camp one Sunday afternoon, a special permission granted now that the war was over. They sat in the visitor area, this farmer and Dea, this prisoner, and Joseph showed Karl photographs of his sons-in-law returning home, both safe, both changed but alive. Then Joseph did something unexpected. He offered Karl a job, through careful English and gestures and a blase. Few German words. Joseph explained that he was getting older, that the farm was too much for him alone, that he'd been impressed by Karl's work and character. If Karl wanted to stay in America after his repatriation was processed, if he wanting to bring his family over, there would be a place for them here, a job, a home, a future. Karl sat stunned, unable to process the offer. Stay in America? Leave Germany forever? Abandon the rubble of Hamburg for the open fields of Nebraska? It felt like betrayal and salvation in equal measure, and he didn't know how to respond. He thanked Joseph, promised to think about it, but his mind reeled with the implications. Could he ask Marguerite to leave everything she knew, assuming she was even alive to ask? Could he raise German children in the land their father had fought against? Could he build a life on the generosity of people his government had tried to destroy? The repatriation process began in the summer of 1945, but moved with bureaucratic slowness. There were millions of displaced persons across Europe. Shattered infrastructure, competing priorities. The American authorities announced that prisoners would be returned gradually. The process could take months or even years. Karl found himself in a strange limbo. No longer quite a prisoner, but not yet free, suspended between two worlds with no clear path forward. In August, the atomic bombs fell on Japan, and the war truly ended. Karl listened to the radio reports with mixed horror and relief. The weapon's destructive power was beyond comprehension. Entire cities erased in moments, but it meant the killing would stop, that the world might finally begin to heal. He thought about the technological gap between nations that such a weapon represented, about what it meant that America possessed such power yet had treated its prisoners with fundamental decency. A nation capable of such destruction had chosen restraint in its treatment of captives. The contrast spoke to something important about character and values, about the difference between capability and choice. Marguerite's first letter after the war's end arrived in September, and Karl's hands shook so badly he could barely open it. The paper was rough, clearly scavenged from some damaged stock, and the ink was faded, but her handwriting remained elegant despite everything. She was alive, the children were alive. Hamburg was devastated, but they had survived, living in the ruins of their apartment building with Estine. Several other families, sharing what little they had. She wrote of the occupation, of British soldiers who were generally fair if distant, of the overwhelming task of rebuilding amid utter destruction. She wrote of hunger, real gnawing hunger that kept the children crying at night, of cold as winter approached, with no fuel for heat, of disease spreading through the displaced populations. But she also wrote of Karl's letters, of how they had circulated even more widely after the war's end, of how people clung to his descriptions of America as proof that somewhere in the world, normalcy still existed. "Your letters gave us hope," she wrote. "When everything was darkest, when the bombs fell and the Reich collapsed, and we wondered if civilization itself had ended, your words reminded us that life continued somewhere. that there were still farms producing food, families sitting down to dinner, children playing without fear. Some called you a traitor for speaking well of the enemy, but most understood that you were simply telling the truth. And truth was the rarest commodity in those final years. Karl read the letter a dozen times, memorizing every word, every hint about her state of mind. She was alive, but suffering. His children were hungry, while he had been well fed for 3 years. The guilt threatened to overwhelm him, but beneath it, he felt a desperate need to act, to somehow help from this distance. He began sending packages through the Red Cross, using the small wages he'd earned from farm work to purchase food, warm clothes, anything that might ease their suffering. He didn't know if the packages would reach them. The delivery systems were still chaotic, but he had to try. He wrote back immediately, pouring out his relief at her survival, his anguish at Quo, her suffering, his desperate wish to be reunited. But he also told her about Joseph's offer, laying it out honestly. "A farmer here has offered us a future," he wrote. "A job, a home, a chance to start over in a land that showed us mercy when it could have shown us cruelty. I do not know what is right, Marguerite. Part of me says, we must return to Germany, must help rebuild what we helped destroy, must face the consequences of our nation's actions. But another part thinks of Greta and Hans, of giving them a chance to grow up with full bellies and warm beds, away from the rubble and the shame. I lead this decision to you. Whatever you choose, I will accept. You have survived hell, while I lived in comfort. The choice of our future belongs to you." The months dragged on with painful slowness. More letters came from Marguerite, each one describing conditions that seemed to worsen as winter approached. The occupation authorities were providing some aid, but it wasn't enough for the millions who needed it. Disease was rampant, dysentery and tuberculosis spreading through overcrowded shelters. Greta had developed a persistent cough that terrified Marguerite. Hans, at 8 years old, had started stealing food scraps from British soldiers, risking punishment because he was so hungry. Karl read these letters to Werner, who was receiving similar reports from Munich. His friend's face had grown gaunt, despite the adequate food in the camp, worn down by the weight of knowledge about his family's suffering. "They're starving while we debate philosophy," Werner said bitterly. "While we talk about the lessons we've learned and the truths we've discovered, our children dig through rubble for scraps. What good is enlightenment if we can't protect the ones we love?" The question haunted Karl. He'd spent 3 years learning about American abundance, writing letters that helped others question the propaganda they'd been fed, growing as a person in ways he'd never expected. But what did any of it matter if his children went hungry? What was the point of moral awakening if it came at the cost of those who depended on him? In November, Marguerite's letter arrived with her decision. Karl opened it with trembling hands, knowing that whatever she'd written would determine the shape of the rest of their lives. Her words were clear and firm, written with the strength of someone who had survived the unsurvivable and emerged with clarity about what mattered. "We will come to America," she wrote, "not because I want to abandon Germany, but because I want our children to live. Greta's cough worsens every day, and there is no medicine, no proper doctor to treat her. Hans grows thinner, despite my efforts to give him my share of the rations. The future here is years of hardship, perhaps decades of rebuilding, and I cannot guarantee they will survive it. You write of a place where there is food and safety and opportunity. You write of people who showed kindness to their enemies. If such a place exists, then our children deserve the chance to grow up there." She continued, "I know what this means. We will be immigrants, foreigners, Germans, in a land that defeated us. Some will hate us for what our nation did. We will carry shame that never fully fades. But we will be alive, Karl. Our children will be alive and fed and warm. That is worth any amount of shame. That is worth leaving behind everything familiar. Make the arrangements. We will come as soon as we are able." Karl wept as he read, relief and grief mixing until he couldn't distinguish between them. His family would survive, would have a chance at a real future, but the cost was exile from everything they'd known. He thought of Hamburg, the city of his birth, the streets where he'd played as a child. the apartment where he'd brought Marguerite as a bride. All of it would become memory, a past severed from the present by an ocean, and by choices made in desperation. He went to Colonel Fletcher the next day and formally requested assistance with immigration sponsorship. The colonel listened carefully, asked questions about Karl's plans, his skills, his family situation. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll help however I can," he said. "The immigration system is complicated right now. Lots of refugees trying to get to America. But you've got a sponsor in Mr. Campbell, and you've been a model prisoner. That counts for something. I'll start the paperwork." Over the following weeks, Karl worked with the colonel, with Joseph Campbell, with immigration lawyers who donated their time to help prisoners resettle. The process was Byzantine, involving forms and interviews and background checks. But slowly, it moved forward. Joseph formally signed documents sponsoring the Neumann family, guaranteeing employment and housing. The Campbell daughters, Margaret and Susan, wrote letters supporting the application, describing Karl's character and work ethic. Even Martha Campbell submitted a statement, carefully written with help from a German-speaking neighbor, testifying to Karl's decency and trustworthiness. The support overwhelmed Karl. These people owed him nothing. In fact, by all rights, they should have wanted nothing to do with him. Yet they spent their time and effort and social capital helping bring a German family to their community. When Karl tried to express his gratitude, Joseph just shrugged and said in his simple German, "You good man. Good men deserve help. That's all." By December of 1945, Karl received word that his repatriation to Germany was scheduled for January, and that from there, he could begin the immigration process for his family. He would return to Hamburg, see the destruction firsthand, hold his wife and children again after 3 years of separation, and then work to bring them all back across the Atlantic to a new life in Nebraska. He spent his final weeks at the camp saying goodbyes. Werner was scheduled for repatriation a month later, and they promised to write, to stay in touch, to remember what they'd learned. The other prisoners, especially those who'd worked on farms and seen the same truths Karl had witnessed, clasped his hand and wished him well. Some were bitter about returning to Germany's ruins. Others were eager to help rebuild despite the hardships, but all of them had been changed by their time in America. The night before his departure, Karl wrote one final letter to Marguerite, knowing he would see her before it Forbel could possibly arrive, but needing to put his thoughts into words. "Tomorrow I begin the journey home," he wrote. "Home to you and Greta and Hans. Home to see with my own eyes what has become of the city we loved. Home to face the reality of what we were part of and what we allowed to happen. But it will be a brief homecoming, my love, because our real home now lies ahead of us, across an ocean, in a place I once would have called enemy territory," he continued, his handwriting growing more hurried as emotions pressed against his control. "I have learned so much in these 3 years, Marguerite. I have learned that everything we were told about our enemies was a lie, designed to make us hate, to make us willing to kill and die for a cause that was rotten at its core. I have learned that ordinary people, in any nation, are more similar than different, that farmers in Nebraska and farmers in Hamburg want the same things: safety for their families, honest work, simple dignity. I have learned that our government's propaganda was not just exaggeration, but fundamental inversion of reality, painting black as white, and white as black, until we couldn't see truth anymore." His hand cramped, and he paused, flexing his fingers before continuing. "But most importantly, I have learned about forgiveness and grace. The Americans had every right to treat us harshly. We invaded their allies. We killed their soldiers. We served a regime that committed unspeakable atrocities. Yet they fed us, sheltered us, treated us with basic human decency. Joseph Campbell, whose sons-in-law fought against Germany, offered me not just a job, but a future. That kind of generosity, that refusal to let hate consume everything, that is what I want to teach our children. That is the lesson I want them to carry forward." He sealed the letter and placed it with the others he'd written over the years, a stack of envelopes that documented his journey from skeptical prisoner to witness of uncomfortable truths. These letters had traveled to Hamburg, had been shared and copied and whispered about, had carried small seeds of reality into a landscape of lies. He hoped they'd made some difference, however small, in helping people see past the propaganda. The journey back to Germany in January 1946 was the inverse of his journey to America 3 years earlier. The ship was crowded with repatriated prisoners, all of them facing uncertain futures in a destroyed homeland. The conversations were subdued, men confronting the reality of what they were returning to, the guilt they would have to carry, the judgment they would face. Karl spent most of the voyage on deck, watching the gray Atlantic roll past, trying to prepare himself mentally for what he would find. Hamburg, when he finally saw it, broke something inside him. The city he remembered, beautiful Hamburg with its elegant buildings and busy harbor, was gone. In its place stood a landscape of rubble and ruin. Entire neighborhoods reduced to broken walls and hollow facades. The firebombing had been thorough, and 3 years later, the scars still gaped. People moved through the wreckage like ghosts, thin and worn, their faces carrying expressions of exhausted survival. He found Marguerite and the children in what remained of their apartment building, living in 2 rooms that had somehow escaped complete destruction while the rest of the structure stood open to the sky. When Marguerite opened the door and saw him, she simply collapsed into his arms, and they stood there holding each other while years of fear and separation and desperate hope poured out in tears. The children hung back at first. Greta and Hans had been 4 and 2 when he left. Now they were 7 and 5, and he was a stranger wearing their father's face. But slowly, carefully, they came to him. Greta with her too-thin frame and that persistent cough Marguerite had written about. Hans with wary eyes that had seen too much for a 5-year-old, clutching a wooden toy soldier that was missing an arm. Karl gathered them both close, feeling their fragile bodies against his chest, and swore silently that he would get them out of this, would give them the chance to be children again, to grow up without hunger and fear. The next months were a blur of bureaucracy and preparation. Karl worked whatever jobs he could find in occupied Hamburg, mostly manual labor clearing rubble for the British authorities, earning barely enough to supplement the meager rations. But every penny he could spare went toward the immigration process, toward medical examinations and document fees and passage costs. Joseph Campbell sent money to help, money that Karl accepted with gratitude and the firm intention to repay every cent through hard work once they arrived in Nebraska. Marguerite proved to be stronger than Karl had even realized. She navigated the immigration paperwork with fierce determination, badgered officials, found ways around bureaucratic obstacles, and kept the family moving forward when Karl's spirits flagged. She'd survived 3 years of bombing and occupation and near starvation. She wasn't going to let paperwork stand between her children and safety. In the evenings, Karl would tell them about America, about the Campbell farm and the endless fields, about the abundance of food and the kindness of strangers. Greta listened with wide eyes, asking questions about American children and schools and whether there would be medicine for her cough. Hans wanted to know about the tractors, about the machines that could do the work of 20 horses. Marguerite just listened and held Karl's hand, her grip tight, as if she could pull all of them toward that distant promise through sheer force of will. They also talked about what they were leaving behind, about the guilt and the memories and the knowledge of what Germany had done. Karl didn't hide the truth from them, even from the children in age-appropriate ways. They needed to understand that they were Germans, that they carried a history now that included both victims and perpetrators, that running to America wasn't escaping responsibility, but seeking the strength to eventually face it. "We will remember," Karl told them one night, all 4 crowded together in their small room for warmth. "We will never forget what happened here, what our nation did, what we failed to prevent. But we will also live. We will build a future. We will raise you children to be better than we were, to question authority, to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. That is how we honor the dead and justify our own survival." End quote. The immigration approval came through in June of 1946, and they had 3 weeks to prepare for departure. Karl said goodbye to the few friends who remained in Hamburg, men he'd served with who were staying to rebuild, families who'd shared the bomb shelters and the hunger. Werner was among them, having decided to stay in Munich with Hilda and Sophie, to face the future in their homeland despite the hardships. The 2 friends embraced, promising to write, knowing that their paths were diverging, but the bond forged in a Nebraska prison camp would remain. "Tell them the truth," Werner said as they parted. "Tell the Americans about what we saw here, what we were part of, what we're trying to atone for. Don't let them think all Germans were monsters. But don't let them forget that monsters were among us, and we didn't stop them. Bear witness, Karl. That's all we can do now." End quote. Karl promised he would, and he carried that promise with him as they boarded the ship in July. The voyage to America with his family was nothing like his journey as a prisoner 3 years earlier. Now he traveled with hope instead of despair, with his wife and children beside him instead of enemy soldiers. They stood on deck as Europe receded behind them, and Karl felt the weight of the past pulling at him, even as the promise of the future called him forward. Marguerite leaned against him, watching the horizon. "Are we doing the right thing?" she asked quietly. "Leaving?" Karl thought about it, really considered the question. "I don't know if it's right," he said finally. "But I know it's necessary. The children need to live, really live, not just survive. And maybe by building a good life in America, by raising them to be honest and kind and brave, we can do more good than we could by staying in the ruins and drowning in guilt." End quote. The Statue of Liberty appeared on the horizon in early August, and Karl experienced it from the other side now, arriving as an immigrant rather than a prisoner, coming to build a life rather than wait out captivity. Greta and Hans pressed against the railing, staring at the massive statue, and Karl told them about freedom and new beginnings and the responsibilities that came with both. Joseph Campbell met them at the dock in New York, having driven his truck all the way from Nebraska to collect them. The old farmer embraced Karl like a son, then turned to Marguerite with careful respect. "Welcome," he said in his practiced German. "Welcome to America. Welcome home." The drive to Nebraska took 4 days, and every mile revealed more of the country Karl had tried to describe in his letters. Marguerite and the children stared out the windows in amazement at the intact cities, the busy roads, the shops with goods in the windows. They stopped at a diner in Pennsylvania, and when food arrived, real hamburgers and French fries and milkshakes, Greta began to cry. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming reality of abundance after years of hunger. The Campbell farm appeared on an August afternoon, golden fields stretching to the horizon, the farmhouse solid and welcoming, barns and silos standing proud against the endless sky. Martha Campbell came out to greet them, and without a word, she gathered Marguerite and the children into her arms, this German family who had been enemies, and welcomed them with a warmth that transcended language and history. They'd prepared the small cottage on the property for the Neumanns, a 2-bedroom house that had once belonged to Joseph's parents. It had furniture and dishes and linens, all donated by community members who'd heard about the German family coming to start over. There was food in the pantry, real food, flour and sugar and coffee and canned goods, more food than they'd seen in years. Marguerite walked through the cottage, touching everything gently, as if afraid it might disappear, tears streaming down her face. That night, they sat down to dinner with the Campbells, a welcome meal that Martha had prepared with care. Roast chicken and potatoes and vegetables from the garden, bread with real butter, pie for dessert. Karl watched his children eat, slowly at first, their shrunken stomachs unable to handle too much, then with increasing enthusiasm as their bodies remembered what it was to be full. He caught Marguerite's eye across the table and saw in her face the same mixture of gratitude and grief, joy and sorrow, that he felt. The weeks turned into months, and the Neumann family began to build their American life. Karl worked alongside Joseph, teaching Marguerite the farm work too, so they could eventually take over more responsibility. Greta and Hans started school, where they faced some prejudice as German children so soon after the war, but also found friends and teachers who judged them as individuals rather than representatives of a hated enemy. Greta's cough improved with proper medical care and good nutrition. Hans began to smile more, the wariness gradually fading from his eyes. Karl kept his promise to Werner and to himself. He spoke honestly about Germany when asked, neither excusing the atrocities nor claiming collective innocence. He joined a local church, and found a community that accepted them, that helped them integrate while allowing them to maintain their cultural identity. He wrote letters back to Hamburg, to Werner and others, describing their new life and encouraging them in their rebuilding efforts. The letters he'd written from the prison camp took on new significance now. People in town had heard about them, about the German prisoner who'd written home describing American abundance and kindness, whose words had circulated in occupied Hamburg as contraband truth. The local newspaper even did a story about it. Prisoners' letters brought hope to war-torn Germany, and suddenly Karl found himself a minor celebrity, a symbol of reconciliation and honest witnessing. But he deflected the attention, uncomfortable with being lauded for simply telling the truth. "I was a prisoner who saw reality and wrote about it," he told the reporter. "The remarkable thing isn't that I told the truth. The remarkable thing is that the truth was so different from what we'd been, quote, taught to believe. The remarkable thing is that Americans like the Campbells chose kindness over revenge. That's the story worth telling," end quote. Years passed, and the Neumann family put down roots in Nebraska soil. Karl and Marguerite eventually took over much of the farm work as Joseph aged, and they proved to be capable stewards of the land. Greta grew into a bright student, eventually earning a scholarship to the state university. Hans discovered a talent for mechanics, keeping the farm equipment running with skill that made Joseph beam with pride. They were American children now, but they never forgot they were also German, carrying the weight and responsibility of that dual identity. Karl never stopped writing. Not letters anymore, those had served their purpose, but a memoir of sorts, documenting his journey from Wehrmacht soldier to American farmer, from believer in propaganda to witness of truth. He wrote about the power of lies and the fragility of truth, about the choices ordinary people make that enable extraordinary evil, about the possibility of redemption through honest reckoning.